The knife was already moving before anyone else in the hall noticed it. I saw the reflection first, a flash of dull metal caught in the chandelier light, sliding out from beneath a server's sleeve as he leaned toward Lady Ystara Ven with a tray of drinks. My body moved before my mind finished the thought. I stepped between them, caught his wrist, and twisted the blade free before it ever cleared his cuff. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. The server dropped to his knees, gasping, and 2 palace guards finally turned around to see what the noise was. By then it was over. Lady Ystara blinked at me, her 4-lobed eyes wide with something between shock and irritation, as if I had spilled wine on her gown rather than saved her life. The nobles around us, dressed in shimmering court robes that cost more than a starship engine, stared at the kneeling server, then at the knife in my hand, then at me, and somehow managed to look unimpressed by all 3. "Must you make a scene?" Lady Ystara said, straightening her sleeve. I did not answer right away. I handed the knife to the nearest guard, who took it like he wasn't sure whether to thank me or write me up for touching palace property. The would-be assassin was dragged away, mumbling something in a dialect I didn't recognize, and the music started again, as if nothing had happened at all. That was the strange thing about this court. Death could walk through the room and the orchestra would barely miss a note. My name is Marcus Voss. I am the only human bodyguard in the Thesserine court, and as far as most of the nobles here are concerned, that makes me barely worth noticing at all. I had been assigned to Lady Ystara 6 months earlier, back when her family's fortune had slipped low enough that they could no longer afford one of the augmented Vexcari guards that every other noble house employed. The Vexcari were tall, silver-skinned, bred and modified for exactly one purpose, standing beside important people and looking dangerous while doing it. They came from a warrior caste that had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of controlled violence, and they charged accordingly. Lady Ystara's family could not, so they hired a human instead. Cheap, expendable, and in the eyes of most of this galaxy, barely more than an animal that had learned to wear a uniform. "You could have simply stepped in front of the tray," Lady Ystara said as we walked the long marble corridor back toward her chambers, her voice carrying that particular clipped tone she used whenever she wanted to remind me of my place. "There was no need to grab him like a common street thug. He had a blade 3 inches from your neck," I said. "I didn't have time to be elegant about it." "Elegance is the entire point of having a bodyguard, Marcus. Anyone can stop a knife. A good guard stops it so quietly that no one at the party even notices." I let that comment pass, the way I let most of her comments pass. 6 months in this court had taught me that arguing with a noble rarely ended well, even when you were right, especially when you were right. The Thesserine court sat at the center of a moon-sized palace complex that orbited a dying star, home to 12 great houses, locked in a slow and endless game of politics, marriage, and quiet betrayal. Every hallway was lined with gold filament and living crystal that pulsed faintly with light. Every servant moved like they had rehearsed their steps 1,000 times before, and every noble, without exception, looked at me the way you might look at a guard dog that had wandered too close to the dinner table. "The pet is at it again," someone muttered behind us as we passed a cluster of young lords in deep blue robes. I did not turn around. I had learned not to. "Did you see him grab that poor server?" another voice said, followed by a ripple of laughter. "So very human. All muscle, no manners." Lady Ystara's jaw tightened, though whether from embarrassment on my behalf or embarrassment for herself, I couldn't tell. She never corrected them, she never had to. In the Thesserine court, having a human guard instead of a Vexcari one was itself a kind of public humiliation, a sign that a house had fallen far enough that it could no longer afford real protection. I was not seen as a soldier here. I was seen as a symbol of failure, walking on 2 legs, wearing a black uniform that fit poorly no matter how many times the palace tailors adjusted it. We reached her chambers, and the 2 guards stationed outside, both Vexcari, stepped aside for her without so much as glancing at me. One of them, a broad-shouldered soldier named Keith Dravon, who served the neighboring house of Vantessa, allowed himself a small smirk as I passed. "Enjoying your evening, Meat Shield," he said, low enough that only I would hear it. "Every second," I said, and kept walking. Keith's smirk widened. He was the kind of Vexkeri who genuinely believed the propaganda his people had been fed for 3,000 years, that only augmented soldiers bred for war could ever be trusted to protect a noble life, that unmodified species like humans were little more than disposable labor dressed up in soldiers' clothing. He was not the only one who believed it. Every guard in this palace believed it, every noble believed it, and honestly, most days, I let them. There was a reason for that, though none of them would have guessed it. I closed the door to Lady Ystara's outer chamber behind us and took my usual position near the window, where I could see both the corridor entrance and the balcony that overlooked the palace gardens. It was a habit from another life, one I rarely spoke about, checking every angle a threat might come from before I allowed myself to relax even slightly. "You did well tonight," Lady Ystara said suddenly, catching me off guard. She was seated at her writing desk, her back to me, her quill moving across a data slate. "I did not say so in the hall because it would not have been wise, but you did well." "Thank you, my lady." "Do not thank me. It was an observation, not a compliment." She set down the quill and turned in her chair to look at me properly, something she rarely did. "Where did you learn to move like that? Most humans I have observed are slow, clumsy. You are neither." I considered how much to tell her. "Not much, as it turned out. Training," I said simply. "That is not an answer. It's the only one I'm allowed to give." Her four-lobed eyes narrowed slightly, studying me the way she might study a puzzle box she suspected was hiding something valuable inside. Lady Ystara Ven was not like most of the nobles in this palace. She was young for her station, barely into her second century, and she had inherited a house already bleeding money and influence long before she was old enough to understand why. She was sharp, sharper than she let most people see, and she had a habit of noticing things that others missed. It was, I suspected, the only reason she had kept me on as long as she had, despite the whispers, despite the ridicule that followed her every time she brought a human to a formal function instead of a proper guard. "There was something strange about that server," she said after a moment, her tone shifting from curiosity to something more careful. "He has worked in this wing for over a year. I have seen him 100 times. He has never so much as raised his voice, let alone raised a blade." "I noticed that too," I said. "You did?" His hands were shaking before he ever reached the tray toward you. Not nerves. Someone had given him something, a drug or a compulsion charm, something to push him past whatever loyalty or fear normally kept him in line. Professional assassins don't shake. They don't need to be pushed. Lady Ystara was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her turning the thought over, weighing it against everything else she had learned to expect from this court. "You believe someone used him, a tool, not the true blade. I'd bet on it. Then the true blade is still somewhere in this palace." She said it plainly, without fear, which was one of the things I had come to respect about her, even as I tried not to respect much of anything in this place. Most nobles, faced with that thought, would have called for a dozen extra guards and locked themselves in their chambers for a week. Lady Ystara simply picked her quill back up and returned to her writing, as if the matter had been filed away for later consideration rather than dismissed entirely. "I will report it to my father's steward in the morning," she said, "though I doubt much will come of it. The great houses rarely investigate attempts on lesser families. It would set an inconvenient precedent." Meaning? Meaning if they took every attempt on every minor house seriously, they would have to admit how many attempts there actually are. She glanced at me over her shoulder. "You should understand that better than anyone, Marcus. Do you know why my family could only afford a human guard? Because the Vexkeri guilds charge more than most houses can pay. That is the official reason, yes." She turned fully now, setting the quill down again. "The truth is that the great houses want it that way. A house with only a human guard is a house with no true protection, in the eyes of this court. It cannot defend its interests. It cannot push back in council. It becomes, over time, easier prey. My father did not hire you to protect me, Marcus. Not really. He hired you because it was the only thing he could afford, and he was too proud to admit that our house is being slowly picked apart by families who smell weakness the way Sarik hounds smell blood." I said nothing, but I filed the words away carefully, the way I filed away everything in this court. It was not the first time I had suspected as much. It was the first time she had said it out loud. "Do you resent it?" she asked. "Being seen as the cheap option. The last resort." "No," I said honestly. "It's useful." "Useful how?" "People underestimate what they don't respect. That's been true everywhere I've served, not just here." I met her eyes. Every noble in this palace looks at me and sees a guard dog. That means none of them are watching what I actually do. None of them are watching what I actually notice. Something flickered across her face, an expression I couldn't quite name, surprise, maybe, or the first faint edge of something like trust. "And what have you noticed? In 6 months of being underestimated?" I almost told her everything then. The servant rotations that didn't add up, 3 names on the kitchen roster who had never once appeared for a shift, the courtier from House Vantessa who flinched every time he walked past a security scanner, the kind of flinch that came from muscle memory, not nerves. The 2 conversations I had overheard in a dialect I was not supposed to understand, spoken by staff who assumed a human bodyguard could not possibly follow anything more complex than a simple order. I almost told her all of it. Instead, I said only, "Enough to know that server tonight wasn't the last attempt you'll see." Lady Istara held my gaze for a long moment, and for the first time since I had arrived at this palace, I saw something other than dismissal in her expression. Calculation, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "it is fortunate I have a guard dog who notices things." I let the insult sit between us without response. It wasn't really an insult anymore. Not the way she said it. It was closer to an acknowledgement. The smallest possible crack in 6 months of quiet dismissal, and in this palace, I had learned to take what I could get. Before I made my rounds that night, I stopped in the small guard room near the eastern stairwell, where off-duty security staff from several houses gathered between shifts to share food and trade gossip they thought no one important would ever hear. I was not welcome there, not exactly, but I was tolerated, mostly because I never spoke unless spoken to, and never repeated anything I overheard. It was a useful arrangement. People forget how much they reveal in front of someone they have already decided is beneath noticing. That night, the guard room was unusually quiet. A pair of junior Vexcari guards from House Corin sat near the far wall, speaking in low, clipped tones about a shipment delay affecting their house's northern holdings, nothing of consequence. But near the door, a Thessalene servant I recognized from the kitchen staff was speaking quietly with a man I did not recognize at all, someone dressed in the plain gray of a traveling merchant rather than palace livery, which struck me as odd, since merchants were rarely permitted past the outer gates without a formal escort. I took a seat near the wall, close enough to listen without appearing to, and nursed a cup of the bitter, over-brewed tea the guard room always kept available. The merchant's accent was wrong for a traveling trader, too precise, too practiced, the kind of accent that came from years of formal education rather than years spent haggling in provincial markets. He spoke briefly, quietly, about supply routes through the eastern wing, then rose and left without ordering anything or acknowledging anyone else in the room. I did not follow him. Following him would have drawn attention I could not yet afford, and there was still too little to act on, only a feeling, an instinct built from years of learning to notice exactly the kind of wrongness that most people trained themselves to overlook in the name of politeness. But I remembered his face, the particular shape of his jaw, the calloused pattern on his hands, that did not match a merchant's work at all, more consistent with someone who had spent years handling weapons rather than trade goods. I would see that face again, though not for several weeks, and by then, the stakes would be considerably higher than a quiet conversation in a guard room no one important ever bothered to visit. Later that night, after she had retired and the palace had settled into its strange glowing quiet, I walked the perimeter of her chambers the way I did every night, checking the balcony locks, the corridor cameras, the small service door at the end of the hall that the palace architects had insisted was purely decorative and had never once been used. It was locked, as always, but when I crouched to check the frame, I noticed something I hadn't the night before, a thin scratch along the edge of the lock plate, fresh enough that the metal beneath it still gleamed. Someone had tried that door recently. Tried and failed, or tried and simply hadn't finished the job yet. I stood there for a long moment in the dim corridor, the palace humming faintly around me, the distant sound of a string quartet still drifting up from some late gathering 3 floors below. 6 months of ridicule, 6 months of being called the pet, the meat shield, the cheap option, and none of it had ever bothered me half as much as it should have, because none of it mattered, not really, not compared to what I could see and what everyone else in this glittering poisonous court could not. They thought a human bodyguard was a joke, a downgrade, a symbol of a dying house too proud to admit its own decline. They had no idea what they were looking at. I ran my fingers once more along the scratched lock plate, memorizing its shape, its depth, the angle of the tool that had made it. Then I straightened, checked the corridor one final time, and returned to my post outside Lady Istara's door, where I would stand, silent and unremarkable, for the rest of the night, watching a palace full of people who had already decided I wasn't worth watching back. They were about to learn how wrong that decision was. The scratch on the lock plate led me nowhere that first night, but 3 days later, it led me to a name. I found it by accident, in the way most useful things are found in a place like the Thessalene court, where everyone assumes the human guard is too simple to piece together patterns that a trained investigator would take weeks to notice. I had been reviewing the kitchen staff rotations again, a task I performed quietly every few days under the pretense of checking food security, which was technically part of my duties, even if no one expected me to take it seriously. 3 names on the roster had never once shown up for an actual shift in 6 months. I had noticed this before. What I noticed for the first time that morning was that all 3 names had been added to the roster on the same day, by the same steward's authorization code, 2 weeks before the banquet where a server had nearly put a blade through Lady Istara's throat. The steward's name was Vos Ellerin, a mid-ranking administrator who managed staffing for the eastern wing of the palace, the wing that housed both Lady Istara's chambers and those of House Vantessa, the very house whose guard, Caeth Dravon, seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding me of my place every time our paths crossed. I did not act on the information right away. 6 months in this court had taught me patience above almost everything else. A human bodyguard who accused a palace steward of wrongdoing without proof would be dismissed within the hour, and worse, would tip off whoever was actually pulling the strings that someone was watching. So instead, I watched Vos Ellerin. I learned his routine, his habits, the small tremor in his left hand whenever he passed a security checkpoint, the same tremor I had noticed in the courtier from House Vantessa weeks earlier. It was Lady Istara, oddly enough, who gave me the opening I needed. "There is a council gathering this evening," she told me one afternoon, as her handmaiden fitted her into a formal gown the color of deep water. "A minor one, nothing of consequence. My father wishes me to attend in his place, since his health has not permitted him to leave his chambers in weeks." "Which council?" "Household stewardship, staffing budgets, supply allocations, the sort of thing that puts half the room to sleep within the first hour." She caught my eye in the mirror. "You will accompany me, of course. Try not to threaten anyone this time. No promises." A small smile touched the corner of her mouth before she smoothed it away, the way she always did when she caught herself softening toward me in front of others. Her handmaiden, a young Thessalene woman named Ruth Palmer, who had been raised on a human colony world before entering palace service, glanced between us with poorly hidden curiosity. Ruth was one of the few staff members in the palace who treated me like a person rather than a piece of furniture, and I had come to trust her small kindnesses more than I probably should have in a place like this. "You two argue like an old married couple," Ruth said, adjusting a clasp at Lady Istara's shoulder. "We do not argue," Lady Istara said. "I issue instructions. He occasionally ignores them." "I follow every instruction that keeps you alive," I said. "The others are optional." Ruth laughed, a short, bright sound that seemed almost out of place in the quiet formality of the dressing chamber, and even Lady Istara allowed herself a genuine smile this time, brief as it was. It struck me, watching her, how rarely I had seen her smile at all in 6 months of service. This was a woman who had learned very young that softness was a weakness this court would exploit without hesitation, and she had built herself into something harder because of it. I understood that instinct better than she probably realized. Before the council gathered, I made one more stop, one I did not mention to Lady Ystara at the time. I returned to the guardroom near the eastern stairwell, hoping to find the grey-clad merchant from weeks earlier, or at least someone who remembered him. Instead, I found Ruth Palmer there, off duty, and sharing a quiet meal with 2 other handmaidens, and I took the opportunity to ask, carefully, whether she had ever seen a merchant matching that description moving through the staff corridors. She thought about it for a long moment, chewing slowly, before her expression shifted into something more troubled. There was a man like that, she said. Maybe 3 weeks ago, he came through the service entrance with a delivery permit, signed by the Eastern Wing Administration. I remember because delivery permits for outside merchants are supposed to require 2 signatures, not 1, and his only had Steward Ellerin's mark on it. You're certain about the signature? I process half the delivery logs for this wing, she said. I notice things like that. I mentioned it to the senior steward at the time, but she said Ellerin had authority to issue emergency single-signature permits under certain circumstances, so I let it go. Ruth's expression darkened further. You think it matters? I think everything matters right now, I said, which was as honest an answer as I could give her without revealing more than I was ready to share. Do you remember what the delivery was for? Kitchen supplies, according to the manifest. Preserved goods mostly, spices and dried provisions from the outer settlements. She frowned. Though now that you mention it, the crate seemed heavier than that kind of shipment usually runs. I remember the porters complaining about the weight. I filed that detail away carefully, alongside everything else I had gathered over the past several weeks. Heavy crates disguised as kitchen provisions, delivered under a single signature permit that should have required 2, arranged by the same steward whose staffing manipulations had already placed an assassin within striking distance of Lady Ystara. The picture was still incomplete, but every new piece seemed to confirm the same growing suspicion that whatever was moving through this palace had been building patiently for far longer than the single attempt on Lady Ystara's life would suggest. Thank you, Ruth, I said, rising from the table. If you remember anything else about that delivery, or if you see that merchant again, come find me directly. Not the household guard captain, not anyone else, just me. She studied me for a moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. You really do notice everything, don't you? Everyone in this palace thinks you're just standing there looking intimidating, and the whole time you're cataloging every little detail no one else bothers to remember. It's the job, I said simply, though we both understood there was considerably more to it than that. The stewardship council gathered in a mid-sized chamber on the palace's 3rd ring, a room paneled in dark wood imported from a forest world I had never heard of, with a long table shaped like a crescent moon, around which sat representatives from each of the 12 great houses, along with their attending stewards. Vos Elaran sat near the far end, 3 seats down from the Vantessa delegation, and he did not so much as glance in my direction when Lady Ystara and I entered. That, more than anything, told me I had been right to watch him. A man with nothing to hide does not work quite so hard to appear uninterested. The meeting proceeded exactly as Lady Ystara had predicted, a slow parade of budget disputes and supply complaints that stretched on for the better part of 2 hours. I stood near the wall behind her chair, as bodyguards were expected to do, silent and still, while nobles argued over shipping allocations for luxury goods that most of the galaxy's population would never see in their lifetimes. I let my eyes drift across the room the way I had trained myself to do years ago, cataloging exits, cataloging faces, cataloging the small tells that gave away far more than any of these nobles realized. Vos Ellerin's hand trembled twice during the meeting. Both times, it was when House Vantessa's representative spoke. When the council finally adjourned and the delegations began filing out, I found my chance. I positioned myself near the chamber's side corridor, the one that led back toward the staff quarters rather than the main hall, and waited until Vos Ellerin passed alone. Steward Ellerin, I said. He startled, more than the moment warranted. and turned to face me with an expression that tried very hard to be pleasant, and mostly succeeded. Yes? The guard. Isn't it? Lady Ven's man. I had a question about the Eastern Wing staffing roster. 3 names, added the same day, same authorization code. None of them have worked a single shift since. His pleasant expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of calculation that lasted less than a second before he smoothed it away. It was enough. I had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker on the faces of people who had far more training in hiding it than a palace administrator. Clerical error, I imagine, he said. The staffing systems in the Eastern Wing have needed an overhaul for years. I will look into it personally. I'd appreciate that. Was there anything else? His tone had cooled slightly, the pleasantness now stretched thin over something colder underneath. Just one more thing. I kept my voice easy, almost bored, the way I imagined the nobles here expected a human guard to sound when he was trying to seem harmless. The service door at the end of Lady Ven's corridor, the one marked decorative on the palace schematics. Someone tried the lock a few nights ago, left a scratch on the plate. I don't suppose you'd know anything about that. This time the flicker lasted longer. He recovered well, offering a small, dismissive laugh, but his hand, the same hand that had trembled twice during the council meeting, tightened almost imperceptibly around the data slate he carried. I am afraid I have no idea what you are referring to, he said. If you have concerns about palace security, I would suggest raising them with the household guard captain, not with a mid-level steward, who has quite a lot of budget reports still waiting for his attention. He gave me a thin smile. Good evening, guard. He walked away before I could respond, his pace just slightly faster than a man with nothing to hide would normally walk. I watched him go, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the direction he took, filing it all away with everything else I had gathered over the past 6 months. You suspect him, Lady Istara said, appearing at my side so quietly that even I hadn't heard her approach, which was rare enough that it earned a flicker of genuine respect from me. I suspect he knows more than he's saying. About the assassin at the banquet, about a lot of things. I glanced down at her. Your family's house steward reports to him indirectly, doesn't it? Staffing decisions for your household run through the Eastern Wing administration. Her expression sharpened, the calculating look I had come to recognize whenever she was working through the political implications of something before she allowed herself to react emotionally. You believe someone inside my own household's chain of authority helped place that assassin. I believe it's worth considering. She was quiet for a long moment as we walked back toward her chambers, the palace's endless golden corridors stretching ahead of us, servants and nobles alike parting around her with the practiced deference her title still commanded, even as her house's fortunes crumbled beneath it. You should report this to my father, she said finally. Your father can barely leave his chambers, by your own words, and even if he could, what proof do I have? A trembling hand and a lie about a scratched lock plate. That's not evidence, that's a hunch. Then what do you propose? I keep watching, quietly, the way I have been. I glanced at her, and you keep pretending you have no idea any of this is happening, because the moment they realize we're paying attention, they'll change their approach, and I'd rather know what's coming than guess at it after the fact. Lady Istara considered this, her steps slowing slightly as we approached the junction that led toward her wing. You speak like a soldier planning a campaign, not a bodyguard reacting to a threat. Good protection is a campaign, I said. Reacting after the fact just means you got lucky the first few times. She looked at me then, really looked at me, the way she had the night of the banquet, as if seeing something she hadn't expected to find beneath the plain black uniform and the quiet, unremarkable manner I had cultivated so carefully over 6 months of being dismissed by everyone around her. You are not what I was told humans were when my father first proposed hiring one, she said quietly. I was told you were simple creatures, strong perhaps, but simple, suited for absorbing danger, not understanding it. Most people in this court believe that. Do you want them to keep believing it? I thought about that question longer than I probably needed to. 6 months of ridicule, 6 months of being called the pet and the meat shield, 6 months of watching nobles look through me as if I were part of the architecture, rather than a person standing 3 feet away from them. It should have worn on me by now. In some ways, on some nights, it did, but there was a value in being underestimated that I had learned to rely on long before I ever set foot in this palace. A value that had kept me and people under my protection alive in situations far worse than a glittering court full of poisoned smiles and hidden knives. Yes, I said finally, I want them to keep believing it for as long as possible. Why? Because the moment they realize what I actually am, they'll stop underestimating me. And right now, that's the only advantage I have. Lady Istara studied me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she nodded, a small, deliberate motion that felt heavier than it should have. Then I will continue treating you as I always have, in public, she said, poorly, dismissively, as my house's unfortunate necessity. I'd expect nothing less. But know that I no longer believe it, she added, quieter now, almost too quiet to hear over the distant hum of the palace's ever-present machinery. Whatever you are, Marcus Voss, you are not what this court thinks you are. And I intend to find out exactly what that means, before whoever tried that door finds a way to try it again. We reached her chambers, and the Vexkari guards stationed outside stepped aside without a glance in my direction, exactly as they always did. Keith Dravon was not among them tonight, and for once I found myself almost missing his predictable sneer, if only because it meant one less variable to track in a palace that seemed to grow more dangerous with every passing day. Inside, Lady Istara dismissed her handmaiden for the evening and settled at her writing desk, though she did not immediately return to her correspondence. Instead, she sat quietly for a long moment, her 4-lobed eyes fixed on nothing in particular, before she spoke again. Vos Ellerin has served the Eastern Wing administration for 11 years, she said. He was appointed by House Vantessa's steward, before my father's health declined and administrative authority shifted. If he is involved in something, it did not begin with the attempt on my life. What are you saying? I am saying that if there is a plot moving through this palace, Marcus, it likely has nothing to do with me specifically. She turned to face me, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying something closer to genuine unease than I had seen from her before, and I fear we have only seen the very smallest edge of it. I did not disagree with her. I had suspected as much myself for weeks now. Ever since the first oddities in the staffing rosters, ever since the dialect I was not supposed to understand had started appearing in whispered conversations throughout the Eastern Wing. A single assassin, poorly disguised, easily disarmed, was not the work of a serious operation. It was the work of an operation still testing its reach, still probing for weaknesses, before committing to something larger. Then we watch, I said, carefully, and we don't let them know we're watching. Lady Istara nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had arrived at this palace, I saw something in her expression that looked less like the practiced disdain of a noble tolerating an inconvenient necessity, and more like the quiet, wary respect of two people who had just realized they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than either of them had first understood. Outside her window, the dying star that the palace orbited cast its long, fading light across the gardens below, and somewhere in the depths of that glittering, poisonous court, I knew that Vos Ellerin was already deciding what to do about a human guard who had noticed far more than he was ever supposed to. The Vexkari guard died 4 nights later, and the sound of it woke half the Eastern Wing. I heard the alarm chime before I heard the actual commotion, a sharp 2-tone pulse that meant a palace security seal had been broken somewhere on the 3rd ring. By the time I reached the corridor outside Lady Istara's chambers, having left Ruth Palmer stationed at the inner door, with strict instructions to let no one through, a small crowd had already gathered near the junction that led toward House Dravos's private wing. Keith Dravon lay in the center of it. I had not expected to feel anything at the sight of him, given 6 months of his sneering commentary and casual cruelty, but there is a particular stillness to a body that has stopped fighting far too early, and it reaches something instinctive in anyone who has spent real time around violence. Keith had been augmented from birth, bred for speed and strength that no unmodified species could match, trained since childhood in the martial disciplines of the Vexkari warrior caste. He should have been able to survive nearly anything short of a direct orbital strike. Instead, he was dead on the floor, A single precise wound at the base of his skull, the kind of wound that came from someone who understood Vexkari anatomy well enough to bypass their reinforced neural plating entirely. "Everyone back," the household guard captain was shouting. A broad-shouldered Thessalonian named Owen Fletcher, who had held the position for longer than I had been in the palace. "Back, all of you. This is a secured scene." I pushed through the gathering crowd anyway, close enough to get a clear look before the guards forced everyone away. The wound placement told me everything Owen Fletcher's investigation would take days to confirm. This was not a crime of passion, not a duel gone wrong, not even a particularly skilled assassin working with a lucky strike. This was surgical, precise, the work of someone who had studied exactly how to kill a Vexkari elite and had executed that knowledge without hesitation or waste. "You," Owen Fletcher said, noticing me for the first time, his tone carrying the same faint dismissiveness I had grown used to from every guard in this palace. "Lady Ven's man, this isn't your business. Get back to your post." "He was killed with a strike to the base of the skull," I said. "Not a chest wound, not a throat cut. Someone who knew exactly where Vexkari neural plating has a gap." Owen Fletcher's expression shifted, just slightly, the dismissiveness giving way to something more guarded. "And you would know that how, exactly? I've studied enough species anatomy to recognize a targeted strike when I see one." "How convenient," he said, though there was less mockery in it now than I expected. "Humans studying alien physiology in their spare time. Go back to your post, guard. This is being handled by professionals." I did not argue further, though I noted, with a certain grim satisfaction, that professionals had apparently failed to notice the same detail I had spotted within seconds of arriving at the scene. I returned to Lady Ystara's chambers, where I found her already awake, standing near the window in a dressing robe, watching the commotion below with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Keith Dravon," I said. "Dead. Single strike, base of the skull." She turned to face me, her four-lobed eyes wide. "House Dravos's guard, he was considered one of the finest in the Eastern Wing, his augmentations alone. Didn't matter. Whoever did this knew exactly how to get past them." Lady Ystara sat down slowly on the edge of a chaise near the window, her earlier composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "If a Vexkari elite can be killed this easily, then whatever protection my house believed the great houses possessed was always an illusion. It was never real protection," I said. "It was theater, status, a way for the great houses to signal wealth and prestige to each other. Real protection means understanding your enemy well enough to anticipate what they'll do before they do it. Most of the guards in this palace have never fought anyone who wasn't following the same formal dueling traditions they were trained in. And you have." It wasn't a question, not really, but I answered it anyway. "Where I come from, there aren't formal dueling traditions. There's survival. You learn to fight people who don't follow any rules at all, because the ones who do follow rules tend to lose against the ones who don't." Lady Ystara was quiet for a long moment, processing this, before she asked the question I had been waiting for since the moment I arrived at this palace 6 months earlier. "What exactly happened to your species, Marcus, that produced someone like you?" I considered how much to tell her. It was a question I had been asked before, by other nobles in other courts across other assignments, always with the same mixture of curiosity and faint condescension, as if humanity's history were a fascinating but ultimately minor footnote in the grand story of galactic civilization. I had learned to give careful, incomplete answers to that question, answers that revealed just enough to be useful without revealing enough to be dangerous. "Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself," I said. "Different nations, different ideologies, different resources, different ambitions. By the time we made contact with the wider galaxy, we had already fought wars that killed more people than most alien species have ever had in their entire populations. We didn't have augmentation technology. We didn't have neural plating or bred warrior castes. We had ourselves and each other and a very long history of learning how to survive against people trying to kill us." That sounds like a terrible history. It was. It still is in some ways. But it means every human soldier who serves off-world has a baseline most other species don't. We're not bred for war. We're shaped by it, generation after generation, and shaping tends to produce something more adaptable than breeding does. Lady Ysthara absorbed this in silence, and I could see her turning the information over, fitting it against everything she had assumed about my species before I ever arrived at her family's door. The Vexcari believe unmodified species are weaker, she said slowly, less capable, beneath consideration as serious protection. I know. Keith Dravon believed it most of all. I know that too. She looked at me then, something sharp and assessing in her expression. And yet you are still standing here, unharmed, while he is dead in the corridor outside my door. I didn't answer that directly, because there was nothing useful to say. Instead, I turned my attention back to the practical matter at hand. Whoever did this wanted it seen. A body left in an open corridor, not hidden, not disposed of quietly. That's a message. To whom? To every house in this palace that thinks Vexcari guards make them untouchable. I moved to the window, scanning the gardens below where the security teams were still working the scene. Keith Dravon served House Dravos, which sits on the Security Council alongside House Vantessa. Both houses have been pushing for tighter control over the Eastern Wing's staffing budget, the same budget Vos Ellerin manages. Lady Ysthara's eyes narrowed. You believe this is connected to what you found in the staffing rosters. I think it's more connected than anyone in this palace wants to admit. I turned back to her. A test assassin at your banquet, easily caught, poorly trained. Then, weeks later, a Vexcari elite killed with surgical precision in an open corridor. That's not random. That's an operation building confidence, testing what it can get away with, and now demonstrating exactly how far it's willing to go. For what purpose? I don't know yet, but whoever is behind this understands something most of this court refuses to admit. Augmentation and breeding don't make you unbeatable, they make you predictable, and predictable things are easy to kill, once you understand the pattern. I did not say the rest of the thought aloud, though it sat heavy in my mind as I watched the security teams below finally move Keith Dravon's body from the corridor. Every guard in this palace, every Vexcari elite trained in the same formal traditions, following the same predictable patterns of movement and response, was vulnerable to exactly the kind of precision strike that had just killed one of their own. If this operation understood that vulnerability well enough to exploit it once, it would understand it well enough to exploit it again, on a much larger scale, against a much larger target. I did not sleep that night. Instead, once the corridor had cleared of onlookers and the security teams had retreated to file their reports, I returned to the scene alone, moving quietly through the dim, sealed-off passage where Keith Dravon had died only hours earlier. The seal on the corridor was a simple energy barrier, easily bypassed by anyone who understood palace security protocols well enough, and I had spent 6 months learning exactly that. The blood had already been cleaned, palace staff moving with the particular efficiency that came from long practice at erasing evidence of violence before it could linger and unsettle the nobility. But cleaning blood did not erase everything. I crouched near the spot where Keith had fallen, studying the faint scuff marks along the polished floor, the angle of scratches on the wall paneling, where he must have reached out instinctively as he fell. The marks told a story the official investigation had not yet pieced together, that Keith had turned to face his attacker in his final seconds, which meant whoever killed him had approached from the front, not from behind as a coward or an opportunist might. That detail mattered more than it seemed. A frontal strike against a Vexcari elite, delivered with enough precision to bypass his neural plating before he could raise his blade in defense, required either extraordinary speed or a weapon designed specifically to exploit that particular vulnerability. I examined the wall paneling more closely and found what I was looking for near the base, a thin puncture mark in the decorative molding, too precise to be accidental damage, consistent with a blade that had continued forward after finding its target, striking the wall as Keith collapsed. I measured the puncture's depth and angle carefully, committing the details to memory. The weapon that made it was narrow, single-edged, and driven with considerably more force than a standard ceremonial blade could generate without mechanical assistance. That was new information, and it changed my understanding of exactly what kind of operation I was dealing with. This was not simply well-trained assassins. This was assassins equipped with modified weaponry, likely smuggled into the palace through exactly the kind of disguised deliveries Ruth Palmer had described to me weeks earlier. I left the corridor before dawn broke fully across the palace gardens, my mind working through the implications of everything I had gathered. A network sophisticated enough to smuggle modified weapons past palace security, patient enough to spend months manipulating staffing rosters and building cover identities, and disciplined enough to execute a precision strike against one of the court's most respected guards without leaving behind any trace beyond what a careful, motivated observer might notice. This was not the work of a single disgruntled steward acting alone. This was an operation with resources, planning, and a goal considerably larger than a single house's downfall. The next morning, the household guard captain summoned every noble house's protection detail to a mandatory briefing in the palace's central security chamber, a rare occurrence that spoke to how seriously even this court's leadership had taken Kayeth Dravon's death. I attended alongside guards from all 11 other great houses, standing near the back of the room as Owen Fletcher outlined what little his investigation had uncovered. The killer entered and exited without triggering a single security ward, Fletcher said, his voice carrying the strain of a man who had not slept in over a day. No forced entry, no alarm breach. Whoever did this either had legitimate access to the Eastern Wing or understood our security systems well enough to bypass them entirely. An inside operation, one of the Vexkari guards near the front said, his tone dismissive. Obviously, no outsider could move through this palace so cleanly. We are not ruling anything out, Fletcher said. Until we have concrete evidence, every guard in this palace should assume the threat remains active and adjust their protection protocols accordingly. I raised my hand, an act that drew several sideways glances from the guards around me, most of whom seemed surprised that a human bodyguard would speak up in a room full of trained professionals. Has anyone reviewed the staffing rosters for the Eastern Wing over the past month? Specifically, names added without corresponding work shifts. Fletcher's eyes found me across the room, narrowing slightly. And you would suggest this because? Because I found 3 names on Lady Ven's household roster matching that exact pattern, added the same day, under the same authorization code, 2 weeks before an assassin nearly killed her at a formal banquet. A murmur rippled through the room, some of it curious, most of it skeptical. One of the Vantessa guards near the front, a tall Vexkari with pale grey markings across his jaw, let out a short laugh. The human sees conspiracies in kitchen schedules now. Perhaps next he will suspect the palace gardeners of coordinating a coup. Several guards laughed with him. I did not react, because reacting would have cost me more than the insult itself, but I noticed something in that moment that mattered far more than the mockery. The Vantessa guard's laugh had come too quickly, too eagerly, the kind of overcorrection that people use when they want a room to move past a subject before it gathers too much attention. Owen Fletcher, to his credit, did not laugh along with the others. What authorization code? He asked instead, his tone carefully neutral. Steward Vos Ellerins, I said. I raised it with him directly. He claimed clerical error and said he would look into it. I have seen no evidence that he has. The room went quieter after that, though the skepticism did not fully disappear. Fletcher made a note on his data slate, promising to follow up, though I recognized the particular flatness in his voice that suggested he was documenting my concern more to close the conversation than to genuinely pursue it. I did not press further. I had said what I needed to say, planted the information where it could be found later if this investigation ever moved beyond theater, and I had watched carefully enough during my brief statement to notice exactly which guards in that room had reacted with genuine surprise, and which had reacted with the practiced calm of people already aware of everything I had just revealed. The Vantessa guard with the pale grey markings was one of the calm ones. I filed his face away with everything else I had gathered, and after the briefing dismissed, I made my way back toward Lady Ystara's wing, walking slower than necessary through the corridor where Kayeth Dravon had died the night before. The security teams had cleaned the scene thoroughly, leaving no trace of what had happened, but I paused there anyway, studying the space, the sightlines, the distance to the nearest service door, the same decorative door with the scratched lockplate that I had found weeks earlier, just down the hall from Lady Ystara's chambers. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, though the full picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Someone within House Vantessa's security apparatus was connected to whatever was moving through this palace. Vos Elaran's staffing manipulations had provided access. A Vexcari elite, believed nearly untouchable, had been killed to send a message, or perhaps simply to remove an obstacle before something larger began. I did not yet know what that something larger was. But standing in that quiet, freshly cleaned corridor, with the dying star's light filtering weakly through the high windows above, I understood with complete certainty that whatever was coming would not stop with a single death, and that the palace's guards, for all their augmentations and centuries of martial tradition, were not prepared for an enemy who had already proven willing to kill one of their own so easily. I returned to my post outside Lady Ystara's door and said nothing of my suspicions to anyone beyond her, because in a palace full of people who had already decided to underestimate me, silence remained the only weapon sharp enough to matter. The security grid failed at exactly the moment the state banquet reached its most crowded hour, and I knew within 3 seconds that it was not an accident. The lights did not go out entirely. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace. Instead, the palace's layered defense wards, the ones that tracked movement through restricted corridors, sealed emergency doors, and alerted guards to unauthorized access, simply blinked out of existence across the entire eastern wing, replaced by a faint static hum that most of the 200 nobles gathered in the grand hall never even noticed. The chandeliers stayed lit, the orchestra kept playing. To anyone without training, the evening looked exactly as it had a moment before. I felt it the instant it happened, a change in the air itself, the particular quality of silence that exists when systems designed to hum quietly in the background suddenly stop humming at all. I had spent years learning to notice exactly that kind of silence, in places far more dangerous than a palace ballroom, and every instinct I owned came awake at once. "Something's wrong," I said quietly, close enough to Lady Ystara's ear that only she would hear it over the music. She glanced at me, her expression carefully composed for the benefit of the nobles around her, though I saw the flicker of understanding pass behind her eyes. The wards? Down. All of them, across this wing. That is not possible. The palace grid has 17 redundant systems specifically designed to prevent. "It's down," I said again, firmer this time. "We need to move." To her credit, she did not argue, did not demand proof, did not waste precious seconds questioning a judgment I had earned through 6 months of being right about things this court refused to take seriously. She simply nodded once, set down her drink, and allowed me to guide her toward the edge of the hall, away from the crowded center, where 200 nobles stood packed shoulder to shoulder in gowns and formal robes, utterly unaware that the palace's defenses had just evaporated around them. The first scream came less than a minute later. It started near the eastern entrance, where the household staff had been serving refreshments, and it spread through the crowd with the particular speed that panic always achieves, faster than any warning system could have managed, even if the wards had still been functioning. I caught a glimpse of movement near the staff entrance, figures in servant uniforms moving with a coordination that no ordinary palace staff possessed, blades flashing in the chandelier light as they cut through the crowd toward the raised platform where several of the great house lords stood gathered. This was not one assassin, poorly disguised and easily disarmed. This was a coordinated strike, and from the way the intruders moved, splitting into pairs, covering each other's angles, falling back and advancing in disciplined rhythm, I understood immediately that whoever had organized this had trained them well beyond what a typical criminal operation would bother with. The Vexcari guards scattered throughout the hall reacted exactly as I expected them to, drawing their ceremonial blades and moving to engage the nearest intruders in direct confrontation, the same formal dueling stance every one of them had been trained in since childhood. It was a mistake. The intruders did not fight fair, did not follow any dueling tradition, and within seconds I watched 2 Vexcari guards fall, not from superior strength, but from coordinated attacks that exploited the predictable gaps their formal training had never taught them to protect. "Down the side corridor," I said to Lady Ystara, already moving, one hand firm on her arm as I guided her away from the chaos spreading through the main hall. Not the main exit, everyone will funnel there, and it'll be a bottleneck. My father's advisors are still in the hall. Can't help them if we're dead too. Move. She moved. I felt the tension in her arm, the instinct to argue, to insist on some kind of noble intervention that her position might have demanded in calmer circumstances, but 6 months of watching me had apparently taught her something about when to trust a judgment over a title. We reached the side corridor just as a cluster of nobles further back began pushing toward the main exit exactly as I had predicted, a surging crowd of panic that would slow any pursuit but also trap anyone still deep inside the hall. The side corridor was narrower, dimmer, lined with service alcoves that most nobles never bothered to notice existed. I had walked it a dozen times over the past 6 months, mapping every inch of this palace the way I mapped every location I was ever assigned to protect, because knowledge like that meant nothing, until the moment it meant everything. We were 3 turns into the corridor when the first intruder found us. He came from an alcove I had checked and cleared not an hour earlier, which told me immediately that this operation had anticipated exactly the kind of evacuation route a competent guard would choose, meaning either they had studied this palace as thoroughly as I had, or someone inside had told them precisely where to wait. He was fast, faster than the servant who had nearly killed Lady Ystara at the banquet weeks earlier, moving with the same disciplined economy I had seen from the intruders in the main hall. No wasted motion, no hesitation. I did not give him the chance to use either. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, the way real combat always does, when every second carries the full weight of a life, depending on the outcome. He came in low, blade angled toward Lady Ystara rather than me, which told me his targeting priorities had been set well in advance, and I intercepted the strike, redirected his momentum into the corridor wall, and finished it before he could recover his balance. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of controlled, ceremonial display the Vexkari guards trained their entire lives to perform. It was fast, efficient, and it ended with him unable to threaten anyone else in this corridor. Lady Ystara stared at the scene for half a second longer than I would have liked, her breathing quick, her composure cracking visibly for the first time since I had known her. Marcus, we keep moving, there will be more. I was right. 2 more intruders found us before we reached the outer stairwell that led down toward the palace's lower service levels, a route I had scouted weeks earlier specifically because it offered defensible choke points that a small, coordinated force could hold against a much larger one. Both encounters ended quickly, though the second left a shallow cut along my forearm that I did not have time to properly assess until much later. Lady Ystara, to her credit, did not freeze during either encounter. She moved when I told her to move, stayed low when I told her to stay low, and by the third intruder, she had even managed to grab a fallen guard's sidearm from the corridor floor, holding it with the careful, deliberate grip of someone who had clearly received at least basic training at some point in her life, even if she had never expected to use it in a corridor full of blood and chaos. "You know how to use that," I said, glancing at the weapon as we paused briefly in a defensible alcove near the stairwell. "Every noble child receives basic combat instruction," she said, her voice tighter than usual but steady. "It is considered a formality. No one expected it would ever matter. It matters now." Before we reached the stairwell, a 4th intruder cut off our path entirely, dropping from a maintenance alcove above the corridor with a speed that told me immediately this one was different from the others we had encountered. Where the previous attackers had moved with disciplined efficiency, this one moved with something closer to genuine skill, adjusting instantly to my position, reading the angle of my stance before I had even finished turning to face the threat. "Behind the support column," I said sharply to Lady Ystara, and she obeyed instantly, pressing herself into the narrow cover without hesitation. The intruder came at me low, favoring a strike toward my knee that would have dropped a less experienced opponent instantly, and I recognized the technique even as I sidestepped it, a Vantessa house fighting style, refined and dangerous, the kind normally reserved for their most trusted duelists rather than disguised infiltrators. That told me something important. Whoever was running this operation had pulled from House Vantessa's own trained ranks for at least some of the attackers. meaning the house's involvement ran deeper than simple negligence or a single rogue steward acting alone. The fight stretched longer than the previous encounters, exchanges of strikes and counters that filled the narrow corridor with sharp, controlled sound, until I finally found the opening I needed, driving the engagement to its end before he could call for reinforcement or retreat to warn whoever commanded him. When it was over, I searched him quickly and found a small data chip sewn into the lining of his sleeve, encrypted, but clearly important enough that he had risked carrying it into active combat rather than leaving it behind. "What is it?" Lady Ystara asked, emerging from cover, her eyes fixed on the small chip in my palm. "I don't know yet, but someone thought it was worth protecting even during an active infiltration. That usually means it matters." I pocketed the chip carefully. "We'll need someone to decrypt it once this is over. For now, we keep moving." We reached the lower service levels within minutes, a maze of maintenance corridors and storage chambers that most of the palace's nobility had never once set foot in, and it was there, finally, in a small mechanical room lit only by the pale glow of a backup power conduit, that I allowed us both a moment to breathe. "How many?" Lady Ystara asked, still catching her breath, the sidearm still held ready in her hands. "How many intruders were there?" I counted at least a dozen in the main hall before we moved. Could be more elsewhere in the palace. This was not an attempt on my life specifically. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone forcing herself to think clearly through fear rather than being overwhelmed by it. This was an attack on the entire court, on every great house gathered in that hall at once. Weight looks that way. Why would anyone risk something this large? An operation of this scale, targeting this many houses simultaneously, invites retaliation from every direction at once. It is not a rational strategy for personal gain. I considered her question carefully, turning over everything I had observed over the past several weeks, the staffing manipulations, Vos Ellerin's trembling hands, Keith Dravon's surgical death, the disciplined coordination of the intruders, now moving through a palace whose defenses had failed at precisely the right moment to allow it. "Unless it isn't about personal gain," I said slowly, "unless it's about removing enough of the current leadership at once to create a vacuum. A coup doesn't need to look rational to individual houses, if the people planning it already know exactly who will step into power once the dust settles." Lady Ystara's eyes widened slightly, the implications settling over her. "You believe someone intends to seize control of the entire Thesserine court? I think it's the only explanation that fits everything we've seen." I moved toward the mechanical room's door, checking the corridor beyond through the narrow gap. "And if that's true, this isn't the end of the attack. It's the beginning. Whoever is behind this needs enough chaos to justify whatever comes next. A declaration, a takeover, something that requires the current leadership either dead or too weakened to resist. Then we cannot simply hide down here." "No," I agreed. "But we also can't walk back into that hall without knowing exactly what we're walking into." I glanced back at her, at the sidearm still gripped steady in her hands, at the composure she had somehow managed to rebuild, despite everything that had happened in the past 20 minutes. "You said your family's house has been losing influence for years, being seen as weak, easy to overlook. Yes, that might be the only advantage we have left tonight. Whoever planned this accounted for the great houses. The powerful ones, the ones worth targeting directly." I checked the corridor once more, then stepped through, motioning for her to follow. They didn't account for a minor house's guard dog, knowing this palace better than the people who built it. Lady Ystara followed close behind me as we moved deeper into the service levels, the distant sounds of chaos from the floors above growing fainter with every turn, replaced by the low hum of the palace's mechanical systems and the steady rhythm of our own careful footsteps. Somewhere above us, a coup was unfolding in real time, 12 great houses caught unprepared by an enemy who understood their weaknesses far better than they understood their own, and for the first time since I had arrived at this palace 6 months earlier, I found myself genuinely uncertain how the night would end. But uncertainty was not the same as fear, and fear had never been the thing that stopped me from doing exactly what needed to be done. "Where are we going?" Lady Ystara asked quietly, as we approached a junction I recognized from my earlier scouting, one that led toward a maintenance stairwell, rising back up into the palace's central security hub. "To find out who's actually behind this," I said, "and to make sure they regret ever thinking a human bodyguard wasn't worth watching." The central security hub sat at the heart of the palace's lower levels, a circular chamber lined with monitoring stations that should have been staffed by a full rotation of household guards at all hours. When we reached it, we found only two, both dead, both killed with the same surgical precision that had taken Kaeth Draven's life days earlier. "They came through here first," I said, crouching beside the nearest console, its display screens dark, its access panel pried open and reconfigured with equipment that had no business belonging to standard palace maintenance tools. "This is how the wards went down, not a system failure, a deliberate shutdown, executed from inside this room." Lady Istara stood near the doorway, sidearms still raised, her eyes scanning the chamber with a wariness that had not existed in her 6 months ago, when the greatest danger she faced each day was social embarrassment rather than actual violence. "Can you bring the wards back online?" "Maybe. It'll take time. I'm not sure we have." I studied the reconfigured console for a moment longer, tracing the modifications with a practiced eye. Whoever had done this understood palace security systems at an expert level, which narrowed the list of possible culprits considerably. This was not the work of hired criminals brought in from outside. This required inside knowledge, the kind that only someone with legitimate access to the palace's infrastructure could possess. "Marcus." Something in Lady Istara's voice made me turn immediately. She was staring at one of the still-functioning monitor screens near the far wall, one connected to a different power source than the primary grid, still displaying a fractured, static-laced feed from somewhere in the palace's upper levels. On it, barely visible through the interference, I could make out a cluster of figures moving through a corridor I recognized as leading toward the palace's central council chamber, where the 12 great house lords convened for matters too sensitive for the broader court. Among the figures, walking calmly rather than fighting, was Vos Ellerine. "He's not running," Lady Istara said quietly. "Look at him. Everyone else in this palace is fleeing or fighting. He is walking through the chaos like it doesn't concern him at all. Because it doesn't, not the way it concerns everyone else." I watched the feed a moment longer, my suspicions from the past several weeks solidifying into something closer to certainty. He's not a victim of this attack. He's coordinating it. Toward the council chamber, Lady Istara said, understanding dawning in her voice. "My father's seat on the council remains active by proxy, even in his absence. If enough council members are eliminated tonight, and Vos Ellerine controls access to whatever succession protocols exist, he could position someone to seize control of the council itself." I straightened, already moving toward the door, "which means we need to get there before he finishes whatever he's planning." "That is exactly what a trap would want us to do," Lady Istara said, though she was already following me, her earlier hesitation replaced by a grim determination that reminded me, not for the first time that night, why her family had chosen her to represent their house, despite her youth. "Walking directly toward the person orchestrating this entire attack. I know. And you intend to do it anyway. I intend to make sure whoever thinks a minor house and a human bodyguard don't matter learns exactly how wrong that assumption is." I glanced back at her. "You don't have to come. I can get you somewhere safe first." "No." Her voice was firm, steadier than I had heard it all night. "This is my house's future being decided tonight, whether I am present for it or not. I would rather face it directly than hide in a maintenance corridor while it happens without me." I did not argue further. There was no time, and honestly, some part of me had expected exactly that answer from her, given everything I had watched her become over the past several weeks. We moved through the lower levels quickly, taking a maintenance route I had scouted that connected to the council chamber's private entrance, a passage originally designed for emergency evacuation of council members rather than infiltration, though it served our purposes just as well moving in the opposite direction. Along the way, we encountered two more of the coordinated intruders, both dispatched quickly enough that Lady Istara barely had time to raise her weapon before the threat was neutralized, though on the second encounter, she fired a shot herself, catching an intruder's shoulder as he lunged toward me from an angle I hadn't fully covered. Good shot, I said, genuinely meaning it. I have never fired a weapon at another living being before tonight, she said, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered the sidearm, though her voice remained steady. I did not expect it to feel the way it does. It never gets easier the way people think it will, I said. But it gets more familiar. That's usually enough to keep moving. Along the way, I remembered the data chip taken from the fourth intruder and paused briefly at a small maintenance terminal built into the passage wall, one of the few remaining systems still connected to backup power rather than the compromised primary grid. It took several minutes of careful work, using tools I kept concealed within my uniform for exactly this kind of situation, to extract even a fragment of the chip's contents, but what I found was enough to confirm my worst suspicions. It was a partial roster, names and house affiliations, cross-referenced against council seating assignments. Not every great house appeared on the list, but House Ven did, marked with a notation I did not immediately understand, alongside 3 other minor houses similarly annotated. Lady Istara, reading over my shoulder, went very still. Those are the houses my father considers closest allies, she said quietly. The ones who might rally support for our family if House Ven's position in council weakened significantly. Which means this list isn't just about tonight's attack, I said, understanding settling into place with grim clarity. It's a longer plan. Identify which houses might resist a shift in council power, then either neutralize them directly or isolate them before they can organize opposition. Then whoever built this list understood the politics of this court far better than a simple palace steward should. Agreed. I closed the fragment of data I had managed to extract, saving it carefully for whatever authority would eventually need to review it. Which brings us back to the same question. Who is standing behind Vos Elarin, giving him the information and authority to build something like this? We reached the council chamber's private entrance just as raised voices became audible from within, and through the narrow gap in the doorway, I could see the scene unfolding inside. Several of the great house lords, those who had managed to escape the main hall's chaos or had never attended the banquet at all, stood clustered near the center of the chamber, while household guards from multiple houses stood in a loose, uncertain perimeter, clearly unsure whether the man addressing them was an ally coordinating their defense or something far more dangerous. Vos Elarin stood at the front of the chamber, his earlier trembling hands now perfectly steady, his voice carrying the calm, practiced authority of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment many times before. The Eastern Wing's defenses failed due to a critical infrastructure fault, he was saying, one that House Vantessa's engineers identified weeks ago and warned would require immediate remediation, warnings that were, unfortunately, ignored by administrations too consumed with lesser concerns to take proper security seriously. His eyes swept the gathered lords with something that might have passed, to an untrained observer, as genuine concern. In the absence of functioning council leadership, I would propose that House Vantessa, whose foresight in this matter has now been tragically vindicated, assume emergency administrative authority until proper succession can be established. He's not just coordinating the attack, Lady Yastara whispered beside me, horror creeping into her voice. He's using it, right now, in real time, to hand control of the council to House Vantessa, and he's doing it in front of witnesses who are too frightened and confused to recognize what's actually happening, I said. Which means we need to make sure they recognize it. I stepped through the doorway before Lady Yastara could argue, my presence drawing immediate attention from the guards positioned throughout the chamber, several of whom raised weapons on reflex, before recognizing me as Lady Ven's bodyguard, rather than another intruder. Steward Elarin, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the chamber, would you like to explain to everyone here why the security breach that just killed dozens of people throughout this palace originated from a console you personally had access to reconfigure? The chamber went silent. Vos Elarin's composed expression cracked, just slightly, the same flicker I had first noticed weeks earlier during our conversation outside the Stewardship Council, though this time there was nowhere for him to retreat to, no polite excuse he could offer to close the conversation and walk away. That is a serious accusation, he said carefully, from a human guard with no standing to address this council at all. I have footage, I said, which was not entirely true, though the security feed we had seen moments earlier had captured enough of his movement through the palace to make the bluff worth attempting. Timestamped, showing you moving through the Eastern Wing's central security hub minutes before the wards failed. I imagine the household guard captain will find it quite interesting once this crisis is contained. It was a gamble, and I knew it, but I had spent years learning to read rooms exactly like this one, full of frightened, uncertain people, desperate for someone to give them a clear direction to follow. Vos Ellarine needed the chamber's confusion and fear to work in his favor, needed the assembled lords too disoriented to question his sudden authority. What he did not need, what he could not afford, was a direct, public accusation that forced everyone in the room to actually consider the possibility that their supposed rescuer was the architect of their crisis. "He's lying," Vos Ellarine said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. This is exactly the kind of chaos an outside operative would want to sow, accusing loyal administrators in the midst of a genuine security failure. The security failure was not genuine, Lady Istara said, stepping through the doorway to stand beside me, her voice carrying the full weight of her family's ancient title, despite everything her house had lost over the years. "My guard identified irregularities in the Eastern Wing's staffing rosters weeks ago, irregularities tracing directly to your authorization codes, Steward Ellarine. He raised the concern with you directly. You dismissed it as clerical error and did nothing." Several of the assembled lords exchanged uncertain glances, the practiced authority Vos Ellarine had built over the past several minutes finally beginning to erode under the weight of two very specific, very public accusations he had no ready answer for. One of the household guards near the chamber's edge, a Thessarine woman I did not recognize, lowered her weapon slightly, her eyes fixed on Vos Ellarine with newfound suspicion. "This is absurd," Vos Ellarine said, though the calm authority in his voice had fully given way to something more desperate now. "You would take the word of a minor house's human bodyguard over an 11-year administrator of this palace's Eastern Wing? I would take the word of the only person in this room who has been right about every warning he has given so far," Lady Istara said. "Over the word of the man conveniently positioned to seize administrative authority the moment this palace's leadership is thrown into chaos." The chamber held its breath for a long, taut moment, and I watched Vos Ellarine's expression shift through several calculations at once, weighing his remaining options, and I understood, with the particular clarity that came from years of reading exactly this kind of moment, that he was about to do something desperate. His hand moved toward the inside of his robe. They was already moving before the weapon cleared its concealment, closing the distance between us faster than his desperate calculation had accounted for, because he, like everyone else in this palace, had spent 6 months assuming a human bodyguard was simply not worth watching closely enough to notice exactly when he might become dangerous. He never got the chance to prove his final threat. The weapon clattered to the floor of the council chamber, and Vos Ellarine went down with it, disarmed before he ever managed to level the barrel toward anyone in the room. I held him there, pinned and immobilized, while the household guards finally moved to secure him properly, their earlier confusion replaced by grim understanding of exactly what had almost happened in front of them. "Get the household guard captain," Lady Istara said to the nearest soldier, her voice steady, despite the chaos of the past hour finally beginning to show in the slight tremor of her hands. "And someone needs to check on the survivors from the main hall. Now." The chamber moved quickly after that, guards fanning out to secure the council room's perimeter, others rushing to relay word that the Eastern Wing's security wards needed immediate restoration. I stayed with Vos Ellarine until Owen Fletcher arrived, his uniform torn and bloodied from whatever fighting he had encountered on his own path through the palace, his expression darkening considerably when he saw who was being restrained on the chamber floor. "Explain," Fletcher said, crouching beside Vos Ellarine with the particular coldness of a man who had lost people under his command that night and wanted answers immediately. Vos Ellarine said nothing at first, his earlier composure completely gone now, replaced by the sullen silence of someone calculating just how much trouble he was actually in. It was Lady Istara who spoke instead, laying out everything methodically, the staffing irregularities, Keith Dravon's death, the security hub's reconfigured console, and the attempted coup unfolding in real time within the council chamber itself. Fletcher listened without interruption, his jaw tightening further with every detail, and when she finished, he turned his attention to me. "You knew all of this," he said. "Weeks ago, you tried to tell me at the briefing. I told you what I had. You didn't have enough to act on it." "No," he admitted, something like genuine regret crossing his face. "I didn't take it seriously enough. I should have." I did not press the point further, because there was nothing to be gained from it, and because I understood, better than most in this palace, exactly how difficult it was to convince people to take a threat seriously when the person raising it had already been dismissed as unimportant before he ever opened his mouth. Fletcher ordered Vos Ellerin taken into secure custody, and the chamber began the slow, difficult process of accounting for the night's damage, house lords checking in with each other, guards reporting casualties, servants and staff being carefully screened to separate the innocent from whoever else might still be operating within the palace under false identities. It was well past midnight before the immediate crisis settled into something resembling order, and it was in the quiet aftermath, in a small side chamber where Lady Istara and I finally had a moment to breathe without immediate threat pressing against us, that the deeper truth of the night's events began to surface. "House Vantessa," Lady Istara said, sitting heavily in a chair near the chamber's single window, the dying star's pale light casting long shadows across her exhausted features. Vos Ellerin was appointed by their steward. Keith Dravon served their house directly. The guard who mocked your suspicions at the briefing wore their colors. I noticed. "You suspected House Vantessa from the beginning." "I suspected someone connected to them," I said, taking the seat across from her, the shallow cut along my forearm finally receiving the attention it had been waiting for since the corridor encounter hours earlier. "I didn't have proof of how far it went until tonight. They intended to seize control of the entire council," she said quietly, the weight of the realization settling over her features. "Using this attack as cover, using Vos Ellerin's calm authority to fill the vacuum left by dead or scattered lords, positioning themselves as the only house prepared enough to lead through the crisis they themselves manufactured. That's my read on it too. How many other houses do you think were complicit?" It was a fair question, and one I had been considering myself throughout the chaotic hours since the security wards first failed. Hard to say for certain, but whoever planned this needed inside access to multiple systems, staffing, security infrastructure, council succession protocols. That's not something one steward manages alone, even with House Vantessa's backing. Lady Istara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window, beyond the palace grounds, still crawling with security teams, working to secure every corridor and chamber against the possibility of remaining threats. "My father built alliances with House Vantessa decades ago," she said finally. "Trade agreements, minor political favors, the ordinary business of two houses trying to survive in a court that rewards strength and punishes weakness without mercy. If they were the architects of tonight's attack, then every agreement my family has relied upon for years may have been built on nothing but calculated patience, waiting for the right moment to move against us, along with everyone else." "You'll need to decide how to respond to that," I said, "publicly and privately. This court will expect your house to take a position, especially now that Vos Ellerin's connection to Vantessa is public knowledge." She turned to look at me directly, something steadier in her expression now than the raw fear I had seen from her hours earlier in the mechanical room below the palace. "My father is too unwell to manage this properly, which means, for the immediate future, that responsibility falls to me. You're ready for that?" It wasn't quite a question, though she seemed to consider it as one anyway. "I do not know if I am ready," she said honestly, "but I know that hiding from it will not make the responsibility disappear, and I have spent enough of my life watching this court dismiss my family as weak and irrelevant. I do not intend to give them further reason to believe it." I found myself, unexpectedly, genuinely respecting that answer, more than I had expected to respect anything a noble in this glittering, treacherous palace might say to me. 6 months earlier, Lady Istara Ven had struck me as a young woman more concerned with maintaining appearances than confronting real danger, someone who had inherited a failing house and seemed content to manage its slow decline with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The woman sitting across from me now, exhausted, injured in small ways she hadn't yet noticed, having personally fired a weapon at another living being for the first time in her life just hours earlier, was someone entirely different. Owen Fletcher found us there not long after, his uniform still torn from earlier fighting, carrying a data slate he handed to me without a word. On it was the beginning of a full casualty and damage report from the night's attack, along with an initial analysis of the fragment I had extracted from the intruder's data chip, which his technical staff had managed to decrypt further in the hours since I first passed it along. 9 houses total on that roster, Fletcher said, his voice grim. Not just marked for isolation, several are flagged for what the encryption calls direct action, which my analysts believe means considerably more than a diplomatic maneuver. Assassination, Lady Istara said quietly. That's the working theory, Fletcher confirmed. Tonight was meant to be the first phase, not the whole operation. Vos Ellerin's coup attempt in the council chamber was the visible piece. Whatever this list represents was meant to run alongside it, quietly, over the following weeks, picking off resistance before the political situation could stabilize enough for anyone to organize a proper response. I studied the data slate carefully, cross-referencing names against everything I had already gathered over the previous weeks, the guardroom conversations, the disguised weapon shipments, the trembling hands of a steward who had clearly known far more than he was willing to admit even now, under formal custody. This wasn't built in a few months, I said. This took years of positioning. Whoever is truly behind it has been patient in a way that suggests real long-term ambition, not simply opportunism. Can you identify them? Lady Istara asked Fletcher. Not yet. Vos Ellering claims he never met the operation's ultimate architect directly, that all his instructions came through intermediaries and encrypted communications routed through House Van Tessa's administrative network. My investigators are working to trace the origin, but it will take time, and whoever built this operation clearly understood how to cover their movements. Then we keep gathering evidence, I said, the same way we have been since the beginning, quietly, patiently, because whoever built something this elaborate isn't going to make an obvious mistake now that the first phase has failed. Fletcher nodded slowly, something like grudging respect entering his expression as he looked at me, an expression considerably different from the dismissive tone he had used toward me during the security briefing weeks earlier. For what it's worth, guard, this palace owes you more than most of these houses will ever properly acknowledge. I intend to make sure my report reflects that accurately. I don't need the credit, I said. I need the operation stopped before it tries again. We'll get there, Fletcher said, though the exhaustion in his voice suggested even he understood how much work remained ahead of all of us. He excused himself shortly after, leaving Lady Istara and me alone once more, in the quiet side chamber, the weight of everything we had just learned settling heavily between us. There's something else you should know, I said, deciding the moment called for full honesty, rather than the careful, incomplete answers I had given her throughout the past 6 months. Before tonight, I'd already started documenting everything, the staffing irregularities, the dialect I overheard among certain staff members, patterns in guard rotations that didn't match official schedules. I wasn't just watching for threats to you specifically. I was building a picture of something larger, because I suspected, even before Keith Dravon died, that whatever was moving through this palace wouldn't stay contained to a single house. You kept this from me. I kept the details from you. I told you enough to keep you cautious without telling you everything, because 6 months ago, I didn't know if I could trust you not to react in a way that would tip off whoever was responsible, before I understood the full scope of what we were facing. Lady Istara considered this for a long moment, and I watched her weigh the admission carefully, the way she weighed most things, with the sharp, careful calculation that I had come to recognize as one of her genuine strengths, however well she had learned to hide it beneath 6 months of practiced disdain toward me in public. "And do you trust me now?" she asked. "More than I trust most people in this palace," I said. Which, admittedly, isn't setting a particularly high bar. A tired laugh escaped her, brief but genuine, the first real laugh I had heard from her since the crisis began. "That may be the closest thing to a compliment you have ever given me, Marcus Voss. Don't get used to it." The moment of levity faded quickly, replaced by the weight of everything still unresolved. House Vantessa's involvement remained unconfirmed beyond Vos Ellerin's connections, and I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that the house's leadership would move quickly to distance themselves from his actions, framing him as a rogue actor rather than an instrument of broader house policy. Whether that framing would hold under closer investigation remained an open question, one that would likely consume the court's attention for months to come. But there was a more immediate concern pressing against both of us in that quiet side chamber, one that I raised carefully, aware of how much it might ask of a young noblewoman who had already survived more in one night than most people in this palace would survive in a lifetime. Vos Ellerin wasn't the one giving final orders tonight, I said. He was coordinating logistics, staffing, security access, but someone above him decided when to move, decided this particular banquet was the right moment to strike. That person is still out there, and they now know their operation failed, which means they'll either go quiet and wait for another opportunity, or they'll accelerate whatever comes next before the court has time to properly investigate what happened tonight. You believe this isn't over. I believe tonight was the loudest move this operation has made so far, but not necessarily the last one. I met her eyes steadily, and I believe that whoever is behind this now understands exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate the people this court has spent years teaching everyone else to dismiss. Lady Astara held my gaze for a long moment, understanding passing between us, without either of us needing to say it directly. 6 months of ridicule, 6 months of being seen as symbols of weakness rather than sources of genuine strength, had just been shattered in the space of a single, brutal night, and neither of us fully understood yet what that would mean for everything that came after. Then we had better be ready for whatever comes next, she said finally, rising from her chair despite the visible exhaustion still weighing on her, because I do not intend to let this court's assumptions about either of us survive much longer. Outside the chamber window, the first pale light of the coming dawn had begun to creep across the palace gardens, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation that the court would spend weeks trying to fully comprehend. But standing there in that small side chamber, watching Lady Istaraven straighten her shoulders and prepare to face a palace that would never look at either of us the same way again, I understood that whatever came next, the era of being dismissed as a pet and a meat shield, had ended the moment the first assassin's blade caught the chandelier light, 6 months into an assignment that had just become the most important of my entire career. 3 weeks after the attack on the state banquet, the Thessalene court convened its first full session since the chaos, and for the first time in 6 months, no one in that grand hall looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that had wandered too close to the noble seating. The investigation into that night had moved faster and cut deeper than anyone in the court had initially expected. Vos Ellerin, faced with the full weight of evidence Owen Fletcher's teams had gathered in the weeks following his arrest, had eventually cooperated in exchange for leniency, revealing a network that extended further into House Vantessa's leadership than even I had suspected during that first tense confrontation in the council chamber. The house's senior steward had orchestrated the entire operation, using the staffing manipulations and security breaches as tools to manufacture a crisis House Vantessa could then resolve, positioning themselves as the court's indispensable protectors, while quietly eliminating rivals and consolidating influence over the council's succession protocols. It was, in its own cold way, an elegant plan, and it had very nearly worked. House Vantessa's public standing collapsed within days of the revelations becoming known throughout the court. Their senior steward was removed from his position and taken into formal custody. Several allied houses that had quietly benefited from the arrangement found themselves facing uncomfortable questions from council investigators, and the broader shape of the conspiracy, one that had apparently been building for years beneath the court's glittering surface, began to emerge in pieces that would likely take months to fully assemble. None of that mattered nearly as much to me as the smaller, more immediate changes rippling through the palace in the weeks since that night. "You've been reassigned," Lady Istara told me one afternoon, 3 weeks after the attack, as we walked through the palace gardens that had, remarkably, already begun recovering their usual quiet beauty, despite everything that had happened beneath their careful landscaping. Formally, effective immediately. I felt something tighten in my chest at the words, an old, familiar readiness for disappointment that I had carried through more assignments than I cared to remember. To where? Nowhere, she said, and I caught the small, deliberate smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, the one she had learned to hide less carefully over the past several weeks. You remain assigned to House Venn, but my father has formally elevated your position. You are no longer simply my personal bodyguard, Marcus. You are being appointed head of household security for the entire eastern wing of our family's holdings, with authority to review and restructure staffing protocols however you see fit. I stopped walking, genuinely caught off guard, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Your father approved that. My father spent 3 weeks in a hospital wing recovering from the shock of nearly losing his entire house in a single night, Lady Istara said. When he finally received the full account of what happened, and who was responsible for keeping this family alive through it, he did not need much convincing. She studied my expression carefully. You seem surprised. I spent 6 months being called a pet by half this court. I wasn't expecting a promotion to follow it quite this quickly. The court's opinion of you has changed rather dramatically since that night, she said, a note of dry amusement entering her voice. Do you know they have started calling you something new in the corridors? Not the pet, not the meat shield. She glanced sideways at me. The nightmare, actually. Apparently several of House Vantessa's remaining guards have taken to describing you that way, quite seriously, whenever your name comes up. I can live with that. I imagine you can. We resumed walking, the gardens stretching quiet and green around us, the dying star's light filtering gently through the tall trees imported from a dozen different worlds across the sector. House Dravos has formally requested a meeting with you, incidentally. They wish to discuss retraining protocols for their remaining guards, given what happened to Kaeth Dravon. Several other houses have made similar inquiries. They want to learn how a human beat their augmented elite. They want to survive the next attempt, Lady Istara said, more seriously now, because everyone in this court now understands something they refused to consider before that night. Augmentation and breeding produce excellent soldiers within a very specific, predictable framework. They do not produce soldiers capable of adapting to threats that framework was never designed to anticipate. Your species built its entire history around exactly that kind of adaptation, out of necessity rather than choice, and this court is only now beginning to understand what that actually means. I thought about that for a long moment, turning it over the way I turned over most things, weighing the truth in it against everything I had learned across years of service in courts and conflicts, far from the world where humanity had first learned to fight each other before it ever learned to fight anything else. There was a particular irony in it, one I doubted this court would ever fully grasp. Humanity's greatest strength in the wider galaxy had never been strength in the way this court understood it. Raw power, augmented bodies, bred discipline passed down through selective breeding programs spanning centuries. It had always been something quieter and more dangerous than that, an adaptability forged through a history most of humanity would rather forget, a willingness to fight without rules against enemies who assumed rules would always apply. Not every human is like me, I said finally. I want you to understand that, before this court starts making assumptions in the opposite direction, there are humans who couldn't survive a single night like the one we just had. There are humans who are exactly as ordinary and unremarkable as this court originally assumed. Perhaps, Lady Istara said, but there are apparently enough of you like you, Marcus, that entire military and security organizations exist specifically to identify and train them, and this court, having spent generations assuming your species was beneath serious consideration, has just discovered precisely how costly that assumption can be. 2 days before that walk through the gardens, I had received a message through a secure channel I rarely used, one connecting back to the small network of human operatives scattered across various courts and postings throughout this sector of the galaxy. The message came from a woman named Grace Whitfield, an old contact from my earlier service, who now coordinated placement and support for humans working security details in exactly the kind of alien courts that had once treated us as disposable labor rather than genuine protection. Word of what happened at the Thessalene court had already begun spreading, she told me, through channels far quieter and faster than official diplomatic reports. Other courts, other palaces, scattered across a dozen different systems, were beginning to ask quiet questions about their own human guards, wondering whether the soldiers they had hired, at discount rates, because no one else wanted the assignment, might be worth considerably more than the price they had paid for them. "It's happening everywhere at once," Grace had written. "Slowly, but it's happening. Courts that spent generations assuming augmentation and breeding were the only paths to real protection are starting to ask different questions. You didn't just save one house, Marcus. You cracked something open that's going to keep cracking for a long time." I had not shared that message with Lady Ystara, not directly, though I suspected she understood the broader implications well enough on her own. Standing beside her now on the quiet stone bridge, watching the reflecting pool's still water catch the fading light of the dying star, I found myself thinking less about the immediate danger still facing House Venn, and more about the slow, patient shift beginning to move through courts and palaces, far beyond this single besieged corner of the galaxy. Humanity had spent its early years among the stars being treated as a curiosity at best, and a convenient, disposable resource at worst, judged by species who measured worth through augmentation, breeding, and inherited martial tradition, and found wanting by standards that had never been designed to properly account for what a species shaped by its own brutal history could actually become when circumstances finally demanded it. That judgment was beginning to change now, not through grand declarations or sweeping military campaigns, but through small, quiet moments exactly like the one unfolding in this palace, one dismissed bodyguard at a time, one underestimated soldier proving, in the space of a single desperate night, exactly how costly that underestimation could become. We reached the edge of the garden, where a small stone bridge crossed a quiet reflecting pool that had somehow survived the night's chaos, entirely untouched, its still water mirroring the pale light of the dying star above. Lady Ystara paused there, resting her hands on the bridge's worn railing, her expression thoughtful in a way I had come to recognize over the past several weeks as genuine rather than the careful, calculated composure she showed the rest of the court. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "For 6 months of treating you the way this court expected me to treat you, even after I began to suspect there was far more to you than anyone here was willing to see. You don't owe me anything. You were protecting your house's standing. I understood that going in." "That does not make it right," she said. "You saved my life more times than I can properly count, in a single night, after months of enduring ridicule from a court that never deserved your protection in the first place. The least I can offer now is honesty about how badly I misjudged you, and how grateful I am that I did not misjudge you badly enough to lose you before I understood what you actually were." I considered several responses to that, most of them deflecting, the kind of careful, professional distance I had maintained through every assignment I had ever served, in every court and conflict zone, across more systems than I cared to count. But something about the quiet garden, the still water, the weeks of shared danger that had stripped away most of the pretense that once stood between us, made me choose honesty instead. "For what it's worth," I said, "you handled that night better than most nobles I've protected across a dozen different assignments. Most people freeze the first time they're actually forced to fight for their life. You didn't." "I had a rather excellent teacher standing beside me," she said, a small smile returning to her expression. "I didn't teach you anything that night. You already had it in you. I just gave you the excuse to prove it." We stood there a while longer, watching the still water of the reflecting pool, the palace rising quiet and golden behind us, its corridors no longer filled with the particular kind of dismissive whispers that had followed me through every hallway for 6 long months before that night changed everything. The court had learned a hard lesson about the danger of underestimating what it refused to properly see, and though the political fallout from House Vantessa's failed conspiracy would likely consume this palace's attention for months, perhaps years to come, I understood that the smaller, more personal transformation standing beside me on that quiet stone bridge mattered just as much in its own way. "What happens now?" Lady Ystara asked eventually. "For House Venn, for us." "We keep watching," I said, the same words I had offered her weeks earlier, in the quiet moments before everything changed. Vos Elarin gave up House Vantesa's network, but he wasn't the architect of the entire operation, just one piece of it. There are still people in this court who believe that plan was worth attempting, and some of them are still sitting in council chambers, smiling politely at everyone around them. Then this is not truly over. No, I agreed. But your house isn't the easy target it used to be, and this court no longer has the luxury of assuming a human bodyguard is something to be mocked, rather than feared. Lady Ystara nodded slowly, turning to look at me with an expression that carried none of the practiced disdain she had once used so carefully in front of the rest of the court, none of the careful distance that had defined our first 6 months together. What remained instead was something steadier, something that felt, for the first time since I had arrived at this palace, like genuine partnership rather than simple obligation. Then I suppose, she said, this court had better prepare itself for a great many surprises in the years ahead, Marcus Voss. Because I do not intend to let anyone here forget what happened the night they finally understood what they had been ridiculing all along. Behind us, the palace caught the last light of the dying star, its golden corridors quiet now, its whispered mockery replaced by something far more valuable than respect earned through fear alone. It was earned through survival, through proof, through a single brutal night that had transformed a dismissed pet and a fading house into something this court would never again make the mistake of underestimating. And somewhere beyond those quiet gardens, in council chambers and shadowed corridors across a dozen other palaces scattered throughout the wider galaxy, other courts were only just beginning to learn the same hard lesson that the Thesserine court had already paid dearly to understand. Humanity did not send its most impressive soldiers to serve as bodyguards in glittering alien courts. It sent whoever happened to survive long enough to be assigned, shaped by a history of conflict that most of the galaxy would never fully comprehend, and quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment someone foolish enough to underestimate them, finally gave them a reason to prove exactly what that history had made them capable of.